I'm sure there's some joke in the fact that the deacon needs a sip of water after reading that gospel before she can preach the sermon. But it is a lengthy gospel, so if you will indulge me. How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? This is the Samaritan woman's opening jab in her conversation with Jesus. This conversation is the longest one that we have of Jesus with somebody else that's recorded into the Gospels. Packed into the 38 verses assigned for this morning is so much information that you could probably preach this sermon 10 times and still not cover everything. But for me this morning, it's the Samaritan woman's opening question to Jesus that sets the stage. This is a story about a clash of cultures and cultural positions. In one corner, we have Jesus, a man, a Jew who worships in Jerusalem, a teacher of both the law and the prophets that has gained some notoriety. In the other corner, we have a woman, a Samaritan, who worships on Mount Gerizim and accepts only the 5 books of Moses. She is a person whose standing in her community seems uncertain. And the Samaritan woman in this story is to stand in contrast to Jesus, but also in contrast to the learned scholar Nicodemus that we got in last week's gospel reading. One of the most obvious distinctions about the Samaritan woman from Jesus and from Nicodemus is that she does not even have a name in this gospel reading. A lot of times, commentators and folks that read this passage read the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman as an encounter that Jesus has with someone that is an outsider or an ostracized person. The Samaritan woman is read as an outcast in her community. She comes to the well at noon in the heat of the day instead of joining with the other women when they make the trip to the well at the cooler parts of the day. She comes alone, and in that she encounters Jesus at the well. Through her conversation with Jesus, it's revealed that she's had 5 husbands, and the man that she lives with currently is not her husband. It's this exchange about husbands that has been used to argue that this woman is a woman of ill repute, that she has been ostracized from her community because she has violated some sexual morals there. In spite of her status as a woman of ill repute, Jesus continues to talk with her about living water and reveals himself to be, I am the Messiah that comes. When the disciples show up, they are shocked to see Jesus talking to a woman, and the Samaritan woman uses this time to exit stage right. But she is so affected by her encounter with Jesus that she goes back to her community and can't not talk about it. She goes back there and tells them about this man that was able to tell her everything about her life. And because of this testimony and witness to her community, in spite of her standing as an ostracized person, people come to believe in Jesus, and they go out to seek Jesus. So the commentaries go that this is a story about a woman of ill repute, and that in spite of her sinfulness, all of these folks come to believe in Jesus. It's a good sermon. We could stop here. It's a sermon about how Jesus can use unlikely people from the lowest positions, in ways that were not thought possible to bring people to the gospel. But I'm not sure if this is the story that John is trying to tell us. I'm not sure if for John, the Samaritan woman is a woman of ill repute. Yes, she does come to the well by herself at noon, and Jesus does correctly see the bit about the husbands, but the husbands does not necessarily mean that she has committed some indiscretion. Women at this time were little more than property. It could be that this woman has been widowed 5 times, or that her husbands used the law to divorce her, perhaps because she was barren. A woman without a husband was left with few options. Remarriage was one, or dependence on family was the other. And it is just as likely that the man she lives with that's not her husband is a family member of her deceased husband that showed her kindness and took her in. And if a woman were barren and had not been very lucky in love and had been divorced several times or widowed, that probably would make her not the most popular person in town, but it doesn't mean that she has committed some transgression. There are other clues in this passage that this is not a loose woman. When Jesus says the bit about the husbands, he doesn't follow up with some rebuke for her to go and sin no more. He doesn't say anything about sin, but instead continues to engage her in the conversation. It would seem that she must have had some standing in her community, because when she turns and goes back and starts talking about Jesus, people actually listen to her. So why the bit about the lack of sexual morals? Where did that come from? Why has the church read that into the story instead of considering the possibility of another scenario of a woman dependent on family for support? The church has had a bit of a history of filling in the backstory for women in the Bible, and a lot of times it does so with the notion of sexual impropriety. It was not until the middle of the 20th century that the church moved away from the teaching that Mary Magdalene was the repentant prostitute and returned her to her rightful place as the apostle to the apostles, the woman who first witnessed the risen Christ and then is sent to tell the disciples about the resurrection. It's no secret that the church has had a long history of struggling with the role of women, and has at times used accusations of sexual impropriety to put a spin on things to keep women in their place. Does the backstory matter? Obviously, I think it does. I'm talking about it on Sunday morning. So if the backstory matters, the story that we give to this unnamed woman, how does things change? In Sunday school, we've been talking about how different images of God carry limitations. That so many of us walk around with an image of God that is very distinctly male, and that can limit our understanding of God and our relationship to God. But then we also talk about how these very limited ways of viewing God can affect or become a stumbling block for other people that are trying to engage with their faith. Something similar, I think, happens here when we create this backstory for the Samaritan woman and other women in the Bible. By interpreting them as people that have some sexual sin or impropriety in their life, we limit their power and witness. Sure, the backstory adds some contrast between her and Nicodemus, but it makes her something less as a human being. So what if we take that out? What if the story is about an encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman where sin is not part of the equation? It's not an encounter that involves judgment, but is instead an encounter that involves a conversation and relationship. One where ideas are exchanged, and one where this woman who has had a difficult life leaves so changed that she can't help but tell people about what has happened to her. And because of her witness, people become believers in Jesus, and they come out to see Jesus and hear Jesus for themselves. If we take today's gospel reading and contrast it with last week's with Nicodemus, Nicodemus leaves his encounter with Jesus still at nighttime and still in a state of disbelief, and seems to return to his community and says very little. The Samaritan woman leaves her encounter with Jesus and is filled with hopeful possibility. She goes back to her people and tells them about it and invites them to come and see, and then says to them, "He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" If the phrase "come and see" sounds familiar, that's because that's what Jesus says to the disciples when he calls them to follow him. Come and see. And it's that last part of the Samaritan woman's question, the "can he," that sets her apart from Nicodemus. While all Nicodemus can say is, "This cannot be true," the woman is open to the possibility that Jesus is the real deal, that he is the Messiah, the I am that has come. She is open to hopeful possibility. When we take sex and sin out of the equation, we're left with a story about transformation and discipleship. We're left with a story about a Samaritan woman that, even though she is a woman with very little power over her own life, is able to become an evangelist to her community. Because of her encounter with Jesus, she is empowered to radical witness. She doesn't understand everything, but she does know that she has to reach out to others and to invite them to come and see for themselves. So we have a bit of a choice. Are we like Nicodemus that's still left in the dark and in disbelief? Or are we like the Samaritan woman who will be transformed by our encounters with Jesus and with our faith, and that then will go out into the world filled with hopeful possibility? If we are going to be like the Samaritan woman, in what ways do we go out and say, "Come and see"? Amen.